"Mom, answer the man honestly, for once." That was my son. He said it in a hallway that smelled like hand sanitizer and burnt coffee, with a folder under his arm and his car keys still in his fist. I didn't argue with him. I didn't cry. I put my purse flat on my lap and folded my hands on top of it. Everybody in that hallway was waiting for me to come apart. My daughter-in-law had brought tissues. She'd already opened the package. She was holding one out, pinched between two fingers, before I had said a single word. I looked up at my son. I said, "Curtis, sit down. You're standing in the doorway and people need to get past." Now, I know how that sounds. A woman on her way into a memory clinic, correcting her son's manners. But here is what none of them knew. 2 weeks before that appointment, at 2:10 in the morning, I had been standing in my own dark hallway with my hand flat on the wall. Not sleepwalking, not confused. Awake the way you are awake at a funeral. And whatever was written inside that folder in my son's lap, it was going to be a great deal less interesting than what I had seen from where I stood. They just hadn't worked out yet that I'd been awake. By the time we came back out through those doors, my son had lost something he never knew he'd set down. I'm Dawn Kittredge. I'm 48 years old. I take in alterations at a dry cleaner's on Route 9. This story doesn't start in that waiting room. It starts with a pan. My husband Jerry bought that pan at a yard sale for $2 before we were married. Cast iron, 12 inches, one chip out of the handle. He carried it home in a grocery bag like it was something. Every Sunday of our marriage, Jerry made breakfast in that pan. Eggs and whatever was left over from the week and too much pepper. He'd stand there in his undershirt and narrate it. He'd say, "Now here is a man who knows what he's doing," and then he'd burn the toast. He died on a Tuesday in April, 5 years ago, 46 years old. He was carrying a sheet of plywood across the yard and he went down on one knee, and then he went all the way down. Curtis was 22. He drove home from Columbus in 3 hours and 11 minutes, and I met him on the porch, and neither of us said anything for a long time. My son was not born bad. I've turned that over enough times to be sure of it. He was a soft kid. He cried at dog movies. When he was 6, he saved a bee in a jar for 2 days because he thought it was tired. What happened to Curtis happened slowly, and I watched all of it. And I still don't know exactly which day it turned. If you've had somebody change on you an inch at a time, stay with me. I think you'll know some of these rooms. For 2 years after Jerry, I was alone in that house. It's a small house, 1,400 square feet on Ash Grove Street, aluminum siding, a maple in front that drops everything it has in 1 week every October. 3 bedrooms if you count the one you couldn't put a bed in. Alone is not what people think. Alone is mostly logistics. Alone is buying a smaller bag of potatoes. Alone is the first Sunday you make 1 egg in a 12-inch pan. I went back to the counter at Prine's 6 weeks after the funeral. Hems, zippers, taking in, letting out. Nearly 30 years I've done that work, on and off, and I'm fast and I'm good, and nobody's ever asked me a thing about it. You learn people at that counter. Not their business, their shapes. A man brings in a suit that hasn't fit in 9 years and wants it let out 1.5 inches in the waist. His mother is dying. Nobody has to tell me. That's not a talent. That's what happens if you stand in one place long enough and pay attention. My whole life, people have talked in front of me the way you talk in front of furniture. I've never minded it. I'm not a woman who makes a fuss. Hold on to that. It's going to matter later in a way I'd have laughed at if you'd told me then. Curtis called me on a Thursday in March, 3 years ago. He said, "Mom, we're in kind of a spot." He and Alyssa had been in an apartment out by the county line. He'd been at the parts warehouse, and then he wasn't. There was a truck payment, there was a card, and then a second card. He told me the number, and then he said it again because I didn't say anything the first time. $61,000. I said, "Come home." I wasn't being noble about it, I was glad. I had been rattling around in that house for 2 years with the television on for company, and my son was asking to come home, and my granddaughter came with him. Etta was 8 then. She came through my door with a backpack and a stuffed rabbit, and she looked up at the ceiling like she was measuring it. She said, "Is this the whole house?" I said, "This is the whole house." She said, "Okay, I like it." They moved in on a Saturday. Curtis carried the couch in backwards and swore at the door frame, and Alyssa laughed at him, and I made 3 trips with lamps. By dinner, there were shoes in my hallway that weren't mine, and I stood there looking at them, and I felt something in my chest I hadn't felt since Jerry. I'm telling you that so you understand. I wasn't rescued, and I wasn't invaded. For about 4 months, it was the best it had been. The first thing that moved was the sewing table. It had been in the front room by the window for 11 years. Good light there in the afternoon. Jerry ran a second outlet along the baseboard for the machine. Alyssa asked, very nicely, whether it might go downstairs. Etta needed somewhere for her things. The front room was the only room with space. She was right, it was. I said, "That's fine." Curtis carried the machine down and put it on the workbench in the basement, under the bare bulb, next to the water heater. He said, "There you go, Ma, your own office." I sewed down there for a week. There's no daylight in a basement. After that, I mostly brought the small work upstairs and did it on the kitchen table after everyone went up, which is how I ended up awake at hours I hadn't kept since Curtis was a baby. That's not nothing, but it also wasn't anything you could name at the time. It was a table. It moved. Then it was my chair. The blue one went to the garage with Jerry's recliner, because the sectional they'd brought needed that wall. I sat at the end of the sectional after that. It's a fine place to sit. Then it was the bedroom. Alyssa was gentle about it, and she wasn't wrong. Etta was 8, sleeping on a mattress in the room off the kitchen, which had a window onto the driveway and headlights that came across the ceiling at 11 every night. My room was in the back, quiet, away from the road. Alyssa said, "Would you ever consider swapping? Only if you'd consider it." I said, "Of course." So I moved to the room off the kitchen, 9 feet by 11. I put the bed under the window because that's the only wall it fit against, and for a year I fell asleep with headlights crossing the ceiling. Every single one of those was the right answer. Told back to me at the time, I'd have said the same thing. That's fine, of course. Nobody took anything from me. I handed it over a piece at a time, and by the end of that first year, the only thing in that house still where I'd put it was the pan. Alyssa ordered the Mailbox Plaque in October. It came in a padded envelope from an online place. Black metal, cut letters, a little scroll at each end. It said, "The Kittredges, Curtis and Alyssa. EST 2023. Curtis put it up on a Sunday. He came back in rubbing his hands and said, "Looks sharp, right?" It did look sharp. That's the thing about it. It was a nice-looking plaque. I've been a Kittredge since 1998. Jerry and I bought that house in 2004 with a down payment we saved in a coffee can and a credit union loan we finished paying in 2019. EST 2023. I said, "That's real nice, honey." If you've ever watched your own name come off something quietly, you already know what that plaque cost. That's most of what this channel is, so if it's your kind of story, the subscribe button helps more than you'd think. I didn't say anything else because what is there? It's a mailbox. A woman who makes a thing out of a mailbox is a woman with a problem. But I'll tell you what I did do. That night, after they went up, I sat at the kitchen table with a hem I was taking up for a customer, and I sewed the whole thing by hand instead of running downstairs to the machine. And I took a lot longer over it than I needed to. The first time my son said it out loud, we were in Alyssa's parents' backyard. The Rethmans have a nice place out on Quarry Road, and they do a cookout every September, and I go because Etta likes me to go. I was carrying a bowl of macaroni salad across the grass. Behind me, out of my sight, my son was talking to Alyssa's father. He said, "She's been having a hard time since Dad." You wouldn't notice it right off, it's little things. Now, I want you to hear that sentence the way I heard it, because it isn't cruel. If you wrote it down on a piece of paper and showed it to 100 people, 99 of them would call it kind. She's been having a hard time since Dad. I had been having a hard time since Dad. That part was true. I had been having a hard time since Dad in the specific way where you're fine all day and then you smell his jacket. I set the bowl on the table. I turned around and I smiled at both of them, and Mr. Rethman got that look people get, the one where their face goes soft and their eyes go somewhere over your shoulder. He said, "Dawn, you holding up all right, hun?" I said, "Oh, I'm fine." And he nodded, slow, the way you nod at somebody who's told you they're fine. That was the first one. There would be about 40 more, and I couldn't tell you the order of most of them because that's how it works. It isn't a campaign with a date on it. It's a weather system. Here is a partial list. In November, I missed a dentist appointment because nobody told me it had been moved because Alyssa had started managing the calendar on the refrigerator. When I said I hadn't known, Curtis said, "Mom, we talked about it Tuesday." We had not talked about it Tuesday. I said maybe I forgot, because that's the shortest sentence in the world and I was tired. In January, I left the front door unlocked all night. I hadn't. I locked that door. I've locked that door since 2004. But there's no way to prove you locked a door. And when I said I'd locked it, Curtis looked at Alyssa, and Alyssa looked at the floor. And my son said, "Okay, Mom, it's okay." You can't win any of them. Everyone has two possible answers, and they both work for the other side. If you say you forgot, you forgot. If you say you didn't forget, you don't remember that you forgot. In February, my son told his wife's mother that I had left Etta at school. Etta got out at 3:10. Curtis got her most days. That day he called me at the counter at 2:20 and asked could I grab her, and I said I couldn't. I was on till 5 and Roxanne was out. He said, "Yeah, no problem, I'll get her." He got her. On time. She came home and had a granola bar. 2 weeks later, at the Rethmans' kitchen table, I heard him say, "That was the one that scared me. She just didn't go." He said it in this low voice. He wasn't performing. That's what I keep coming back to. Nobody in that kitchen was enjoying themselves. They all thought they were being good to me. And I sat there with a cup of coffee going cold in my hands, and I did the arithmetic on how many people in this town now believed I had left an 8-year-old standing on a sidewalk. I said nothing. What am I going to do? Stand up in that kitchen and say it isn't true? You know what that looks like. I know exactly what that looks like. The word Cedar Row came into the house in March. Cedar Row is out past the fairgrounds. It's a nice place. Brick, low, a little pond with a fountain in it, and a sign in a flower bed. I've hemmed curtains for a woman who works in the kitchen there. Alyssa brought it up at dinner. She had it on her phone already, which meant it hadn't just occurred to her. She said, "There's a whole activities thing, and they do the meals." Curtis said, "It's $48.50 a month." I said, $4,850. He said, "Right, but that's everything. That's your food, your utilities, your everything." Etta was at the table. She had a piece of chicken on her fork and she'd stopped moving it. I said, "And what pays for that, Curtis?" He said, "The house pays for that." There it was. On a Wednesday, over chicken. And here's the strange part. He said it easily. He said it the way you'd say the bus pays for that, or the check pays for that. It had been a real sentence in his head so long it had worn smooth. I said, "I see." He said, "Ma, don't do that." I said, "Do what?" He said, "The thing where you say, 'I see.'" I got up and I cleared my plate and Etta's, and I ran the water hot, and behind me Alyssa said something quiet to him and he said something quiet back. He went out to the driveway with his phone. The window over that sink is open from April, and my son has never once in his life worked out how far his voice carries. He said, "No, she'll fight it. They all fight it at first." A pause. And then in a year, she'll be glad. You watch. He wasn't lying to whoever was on that phone. That's the part I keep. He believed it the way you believe a thing you've said to yourself in the truck 400 times. I stood at that sink with my hands in the water, and I looked out the window over it, the one Jerry put in when the old one rotted, and I thought, $318,000. I knew the number because a man had already been in my house to say it. That was the February before. Curtis said a buddy was coming by about the gutters. The man who came did not look at the gutters. He walked through the house with a phone out, taking pictures, asked what year the furnace was, and stood in the room off the kitchen, my room, my bed under the window, and said, 9 by 11? I said, about that. He said, thanks, ma'am, and wrote it down. At the door, he shook Curtis's hand and said, I'd say 318, 325 if you do something about that bathroom. And Curtis said, appreciate it, Rick. Then he shut the door and turned around and saw me standing in the kitchen doorway with a dish towel, and for about half a second, my son's face was the face of a boy who had been caught. Then it wasn't. He said, just curious what it's worth. Everybody should know what their house is worth. I said, that's true. And I dried the glass I was holding, and I put it in the cupboard, and I did not say the other thing, which was, it's worth what it's worth. It doesn't need to be worth it by March. One more thing from that spring, and then the pan. In March, I was clearing the kitchen table, and there was a page under the mail. Printed off the internet, folded in 3, gone soft the way paper goes when it's been in a pocket a while. It was about early onset Alzheimer's. 4 lines run through with a yellow highlighter, and in the margin, in my son's handwriting, the handwriting I taught him at that same table, it said, Mom, 2 years? 3? Not a note to anybody. There was nobody to show it to. He'd written it to himself. I folded it back the way it was and put it under the mail. I'd been telling myself he was lying to us. Now, the pan. I need to slow down here because everything after this runs off it. The first time was the 12th of April. I know the date because it was 3 days before the anniversary of Jerry. I woke up at 4 in the morning to the smoke alarm and that smell, that hot metal and old grease smell, and I came out of my room and the kitchen was full of a haze you could taste. The pan was on the front burner, the burner was on medium, the pan was empty and black and the handle was too hot to touch. There were 2 dish towels on the counter next to it, and one of them had gone brown along the edge. Curtis came down the stairs 2 at a time. He turned off the burner and threw open the window over the sink, and he put his hands on the counter and stood there with his head down, breathing. Then he turned around and looked at me and said, Mom. Just that, Mom. And I said, this is the part I'd take back. I said, I don't know. Because I didn't. At 4 in the morning in a kitchen full of smoke with my son looking at me like that. I had gone to bed at 11. I had made a cup of tea at 10 and I'd used the kettle, the electric kettle, and I'd washed the cup. I knew that the way you know your own hands. But there was the pan. Alyssa came down in her robe with her phone light on and she said, oh my God, and she set it into her hand. Etta stood at the bottom of the stairs in pajamas with rabbits on them, and nobody sent her back up. She looked at the stove and she looked at me. Curtis said, we're okay, everybody's okay, go on back to bed, Bug. Nobody went back to bed. I sat at that kitchen table till it got light, and my son sat across from me, and he was kind to me. I want that on the record. He got me a glass of water. He put his hand over mine and he said, nothing happened, okay? Nothing happened. And I thought, I have lost the thread. Whatever this is, it has started. The second time was the 26th of April. Same pan, same burner, 2:30. The alarm didn't go off. Alyssa smelled it. It cost us a pan lid with a plastic knob on it, which is now a black smear on my ceiling I've never got off. That was the night Curtis said the word doctor. He said it gently, in the kitchen, at 3 in the morning, and he was crying a little. My son was crying. He said, Ma, I'm scared. I'm scared, okay?" And I said, "All right, honey." I said all right, at 3 in the morning, in my own kitchen, to my son. Here's what I did next, and it isn't clever, and it wasn't a plan. I stopped sleeping. Not deliberately. I'd lie down in that little room with the headlights going across the ceiling, and I'd think about the pan and my hands, and I'd get up and go check the stove. Then I'd lie back down and get up and check it again. That's a thing that happens to people. And if that had gone on for another month, I'd have believed every word they said about me, because I was already halfway there. So on the night of the 27th of May, at 2:10 in the morning, I was awake. I got up for water. I didn't turn on the hall light. I never did. The hall light is right outside Etta's door now, and it goes under it. I came down the hall in the dark, in my bare feet, on the runner Jerry and I bought at the outlet in Wheeling, and I stopped where the hall opens into the kitchen, and I put my hand flat on the wall. Because the kitchen wasn't empty. My son was standing at the stove in a t-shirt and gym shorts with his back to me. The oven clock was the only light in the room. He wasn't doing anything fast. He wasn't sneaking. That's what I need you to understand about it. He was standing there the way you stand there when you're waiting for the coffee. He put the pan on the front burner. He set it down carefully so it wouldn't ring against the grate. He turned the knob. The igniter clicked 3 times and caught, and his face came up blue for a second in that light. He turned it down a little. Then he took the dish towel off the oven handle and folded it once and laid it on the counter, next to the burner. Not on it, next to it. And then my son stood there for maybe 4 seconds with his hands on the edge of the counter looking down at it. Then he went upstairs. He walked right past the mouth of that hallway. He was 3 feet from me. He didn't look left, because there was no reason on this earth for him to look left. I stood there with my hand on the wall and I listened to him go up, and I listened to the bedroom door, and then it was just me and the sound of a gas burner in the dark. I'll tell you what I thought about. I didn't think about the police and I didn't think about lawyers. I thought, he folded the towel. He folded it before he put it down. 27 years old and his hands still do what I taught them. I stood there long enough that my feet got cold on the runner. Then I went in and I turned the burner off. The pan was just starting to smell, not smoke, that first hot smell before smoke. I put the towel back on the oven handle, folded the way he'd folded it. The dentist, the checkbook, the door I know I locked. Etta on the sidewalk she never once stood on. I'd taken every one of them. I'd said maybe I forgot and, all right, honey, and I had been 3/4 of the way towards signing my own name to it. It wasn't rage. It was closer to what you feel when a fever breaks. Everything came back into focus and I hated the shape of it. I did not go up those stairs. I went back down the hall. I got into bed with my feet still cold, and at some point the sky started going gray at the edge of the blind, and I heard the first car go by on Ash Grove. In the morning I got up and washed the pan. Curtis came down at 7 and stopped in the doorway. The kitchen was clean, the window wasn't open, the pan was in the rack with the water still on it. He looked at the stove, he looked at the pan. Then he looked at me, and I was at the table with my coffee and a blouse I was letting out for Marcy Dieter. I said, "Morning." He said, "Morning." He got a bowl down, he poured his cereal, he stood at the counter and ate it, and he did not sit down, and he did not ask me one single question about that pan. That's how I knew for certain. Not the hallway. The hallway I could have made myself doubt given 3 weeks and a doctor. It was that he came into a kitchen expecting smoke and found none, and asked nothing. The days after that I've never found the right words for. You get up, you make coffee for a house. Your son comes down and says the truck's making a noise again. You say, "Which noise?" He says, "The noise." You say, "Take it to Dell's." You do all of that with your face and your voice, and the whole time, in a room behind your face, there's a woman standing in a dark hallway with her hand on the wall. He'd say, "Ma, salt?" And I'd hand it to him, and our fingers would touch on the shaker, and the salt would weigh about 40 pounds, and nobody else at that table could feel it. The next morning, I took the pan downstairs. I didn't hide it. I put it on the shelf over the workbench, next to the good roasting pan, where a pan can perfectly well live. If anybody asked, I'd say I was tired of it taking up room on the stove. Nobody asked. Nothing happened. Not one thing. No smoke, no smell, no alarm, no towel. 4 quiet nights. On the 1st of June, I brought it back up. I told myself I was bringing it up because it was Sunday and I wanted eggs. That was a lie, and I knew it while I was carrying it up the stairs. Then I sat up. I did not put that pan back on the stove and go to bed. I put it back, and I sat in the dark at the kitchen table with a hem in my lap and no light on, from 11 o'clock, and I waited. Etta was asleep 12 feet away with her door open. He came down at 10 to 2 the second night. He didn't see me. There's a corner where the table meets the wall, and if you're sitting in it and you don't move, a man coming down his own stairs at 2 in the morning looks at the stove, because the stove is what he came for. Pan, knob, 3 clicks. The towel, folded once, laid on the counter beside it. Then he went back up. I counted to 60 twice because I wanted to be certain he'd gone all the way to the bedroom. Then I got up and I turned it off. The pan was barely warm. There was no smoke and no smell and no alarm, and nobody in that house woke up. And that is the only reason I can tell this part without my hands going. I sat back down at that table until it got light. I did that every night after, right up to the appointment. 11 to 4, in the corner by the wall, with piecework I mostly didn't do. 6 nights. He came down on one more of them, and I counted to 60 twice and turned it off. I wasn't collecting anything. I was sitting between my granddaughter and my son's idea, because I couldn't think of anything else that didn't end with a police car in front of my house. The clinic called on a Thursday. I know it was a Thursday because Thursday's my short day, and I was home at 2. The phone in the kitchen rang, the landline, which nobody in that house uses but me. A woman said, "Is this Dawn Kittredge?" I said it was. She said, "I'm calling to confirm your intake appointment at the Memory and Aging Clinic for Tuesday morning at 10:40. Please bring your insurance card and a list of your medications, and we do ask that a family member accompany you." And I said, "Yes, ma'am, 10:40. I wrote it on the pad by the phone. My hand was fine. Then I stood in that kitchen and I looked at the calendar on the refrigerator, the one Alyssa manages, and there it was, in her handwriting, in the Tuesday square. Dr. Apport, 10:40. Nobody in that house had told me. It had been on my own refrigerator for 11 days, in a code, in a woman's small, tidy handwriting, in the house I bought in 2004. I put the cap back on the pen. I stood there a while. Then I called Lou Doss. Lou has had the upholstery shop on Bidwell for 31 years. 4 arms like a farmhand, 1 cigarette a day at 4 o'clock out the back door, quitting since 2011. She taught me piping when I was 22, and she's the only person alive who knew both me and Jerry from before. I drove over. She had a wing chair on the bench, stripped to the frame, and she didn't stop working while I talked, which is why I could talk. I didn't tell her all of it, not close to all of it. I told her the appointment was on the calendar and nobody had told me. I told her about Cedar Row and the number. I told her about the man named Rick who measured my bedroom. I did not tell her about the hallway. I've had 2 years to work out why. Part of it was that I wasn't ready to hear it out loud in another person's voice. But most of it, if I'm honest, was this. The second I said it to Lou Doss, it would exist outside of me, and I would not be able to take it back. And I did not yet know what I wanted to do with it. Lou put her hammer down. She said, "Dawn, are you all right in that house?" I said, "Physically?" And she looked at me for a long moment, and then she picked the hammer back up, which is one of the 10 kindest things anyone has ever done for me. She said, "What time Tuesday?" I said, 10:40. She said, "I'll drive you." I said, "Curtis is driving me." She said, "Then I'll come too." I said, "Lou." She said, "I've got a chair I can bring." Now Etta. Etta was 9 that spring. She had lost 2 teeth on the same side, and she had opinions about horses, and she could not be made to wear a coat. Friday nights were ours. That started when they moved in, and it never got moved to the basement with everything else. She'd sit on the tall stool at the kitchen table, and I'd do whatever piecework I had, and she'd talk. There is no subject a 9-year-old cannot connect to horses. Around March, I'd started teaching her to sew a hem. Real hem, by hand, blind stitch, on a scrap of denim I kept for it. Her stitches were enormous. She was so proud of them. She said once, "Grandma, why do you always look at people's clothes?" I said, "Because clothes tell you things, whether somebody's been sick, whether they've been standing outside in the cold waiting for somebody." She thought about it. She said, "That's kind of like spying." I said, "It's kind of like paying attention." Here's the thing I didn't know that night, and wouldn't know until the clinic. Etta had been getting up at night. She'd been getting up at night for months to use the bathroom, because she drinks a glass of water in bed, which she has been told about, and the bathroom in that house is at the top of the stairs. And from the top of those stairs, you can see straight down into the kitchen. She was 9. She wasn't spying on anybody. She was a kid who had to pee. The night before the appointment, my son was good to me. That's the sentence I have the most trouble with, out of all of them. He came home at 5 with the gutter guards he'd been saying he'd get since October, and he got the ladder out, and he did all 4 runs before dark, and he came in with his hands black and his ears red from the wind. He said, "There's about a pound of maple in the front one. That's your tree, Ma. Dad always said that tree was a mistake." And I laughed, because it's true. Jerry did say that every October for 20 years. He washed his hands at the kitchen sink and stood there drying them, and he said, "You know he'd have done those in an hour." I said, "He'd have done them in an hour and complained for 2. Curtis laughed. Then his face did something. He said, "Ma, about tomorrow." I said, He said, it's just a baseline, that's all it is. They just want a baseline, so if anything changes, they've got something to compare it to." I said, "I know what it is." He said, "I'm not trying to take anything away from you." And I looked at my son, standing at my sink, drying his hands on my towel, 27 years old, with the shoulders his father gave him. And I said, "I know you think that." He didn't hear it. He heard, "I know." He wanted to hear, "I know," so that's what he heard. He said, "Okay, good." And he hung the towel up on the oven handle. He folded it first. I sat up that night the same as the others. 11 o'clock, the corner by the wall, no light on. At about 1, I heard the floor over my head, and I sat there in the dark with my hands still, and I waited. Nothing. He didn't come down. Not the night before a memory clinic appointment. Of course he didn't. At 6, I went and got dressed, and I thought about what I put on for a long time. Navy skirt, white blouse with the small collar, Jerry's mother's watch. Low heels, which I do not wear to a doctor, because I know exactly how a woman is read in a room like that. I have stood at a counter for 31 years watching people read each other's clothes and get it right 9 times out of 10. I was not going into that building in an elastic waistband. Alyssa said, "You look nice." I said, "Thank you, honey." Etta came down in her school clothes and said, "Are you sick?" I said, "No, baby, it's just a checkup." She said, "Can I come?" Curtis said, "You've got school." And Alyssa said, "It's a half day, it's conferences." There was a pause in that kitchen about a foot deep. Then my son said, "Fine, she can come, bring your tablet." That moment has cost me more sleep than anything else in this story. If Alyssa had not remembered it was a half day, if Curtis had said no, if I had said no, and I could have said, "Sweetheart, this'll be boring, stay with your mom." I didn't say anything. I picked up my purse. The clinic is on the third floor of the medical building behind the hospital, and the elevator is slow, and there's a corridor between the elevator and the door with 11 chairs along one wall. Lou was already in one of them. She'd got there 20 minutes early, and she had a magazine she wasn't reading. Curtis stopped when he saw her. He said, "Lou." She said, "Curtis." He said, "You didn't have to come out for this." She said, "I didn't come out for you, honey." And she went back to her magazine. I signed in at the window. Dawn Kittredge, 1040, date of birth. Reason for visit. There was a line for it, and Curtis reached over and filled that one in himself. Then we sat in the corridor. Etta had her tablet with the sound off. Alyssa had the tissues out already. And my son stood up because he couldn't sit, and he stood in the doorway with the folder under his arm and his keys still in his fist. And he said it. "Mom, answer the man honestly, for once." And I put my purse flat on my lap and folded my hands on it, and I said, "Curtis, sit down. You're standing in the doorway and people need to get past." He sat down. They took me back at 11. Dr. Sandhu was maybe 60, gray at the temples, reading glasses pushed up, a tie with small anchors on it that his wife or his daughter picked out. He shook my hand and said, "Mrs. Kittredge, thank you for coming in. I'd like to start by talking to you by yourself if that's all right, and then we'll bring your family in." Curtis said, I put together the timeline of the incidents." Dr. Sandhu said, "Wonderful, leave it with me. Take a seat outside." I have never heard anybody do that to my son that fast, that pleasantly. We were in that room 50 minutes. He gave me 3 words and made me carry them through 5 minutes of other conversation, and then asked me for them, and I gave him all 3, in order, because I'm the kind of person who'd notice he asked in order. He had me draw a clock. He had me name as many animals as I could in a minute, and I got 22, and I stalled at about second 40 and said possum twice and apologized, and he said, "Everybody does." Then he took his glasses off. He said, "Mrs. Kittredge, I want to be straightforward with you. Nothing in this screening is abnormal for a woman of 48. Nothing is even borderline." I said, "All right." He said, "That doesn't rule things out. There are things a screen like this won't catch, and if the events described here are accurate, I'd want to keep an eye on you." I said, "That's fair." He put his hand flat on the folder. My son's folder. He said, "Who is reporting these events?" I said, "My son." He said, "Were you present for any of them?" And I looked at that man's tie with the little anchors on it, and I thought about how you can spend your whole life waiting for one person to ask you one direct question. I said, "I was asleep for all of them." He wrote something down. He didn't ask me the next thing. He could have. He wrote it down and he said, "Let's bring them in." Curtis's phone rang while Dr. Sandhu was at the door. He looked at it and stood up fast and said, "It's Dell. It's about the job. I have to take this. 1 minute." And he was already going down the corridor toward the elevator with the phone at his ear. And Alyssa went after him with her purse because her purse was on his chair. So it was Lou and me and Etta on the 11 chairs, and Dr. Sandhu standing in his doorway with a folder. He looked at Etta the way doctors look at kids when they've got a minute. Friendly. Idle. He said, "And who's this?" Etta said, "Etta." He said, "Etta, are you the granddaughter?" She said, "Yes." He said, and this was nothing. This was a man making conversation in a hallway. He said, "Does your grandma still do the cooking at your house?" And my granddaughter said, "She's not allowed anymore because of the stove." Dr. Sandhu said, And Etta said, "But it's not her. It's my dad." The corridor did not go quiet because corridors don't. The elevator dinged somewhere. A phone rang behind the window. Dr. Sandhu got down on one knee. He did it slowly, and he put the folder on the chair beside her, and he said, "What do you mean, sweetheart?" Etta said, "He turns it on. At night. I saw him 4 times." He said, 4 times. She said, "I have to go to the bathroom at night, and you can see the kitchen from the top of the stairs." She said it the way you'd explain that the bus comes at 7:50. He puts the black pan on, and then he turns the knob, and then he goes to bed. Dr. Sandhu said, "Did you tell anybody?" And Etta said, "I told my dad. He said it was to help Grandma." Then she looked at me, and her face came apart, because she was 9, and because that's the moment a 9-year-old finds out that the sentence she's been carrying around wasn't a normal sentence. She said, "Grandma, is that bad?" I got out of that chair, and I got her against me, and I said, "No, baby, you didn't do one thing wrong. Not one." Lou Doss had not moved and had not made a sound, and her magazine was on the floor. Dr. Sandhu asked me to step back into his office. He closed the door. He didn't sit down, and neither did I. He said, "Mrs. Kittredge, I need you to understand what has already happened, because some of it isn't up to either of us." I said, "All right." He said, "Your granddaughter has just told me that an adult in her household repeatedly creates a fire hazard at night in the home where she sleeps. She is 9. I am a mandated reporter. I am required to report that today, and I am going to, and there is no version of this conversation where I don't." I said, "To who?" He said, "Children's Services, possibly the sheriff. That's not my decision either." I want to tell you what went through me when he said that, because it wasn't what you'd think. It wasn't fear for my son. It was, and it wasn't. It was that for 2 weeks I had been sitting in a chair in the dark from 11 to 4 because I could not think of a way to stop it that didn't cost everybody everything. And a man in a tie with anchors on it had just told me it was already stopped, and that it had been taken out of my hands, and that I could put the chair back. I sat down. I hadn't meant to. He said, "Mrs. Kittredge, do you have anything you want to tell me?" And there it was. The only real question anybody had asked me in 3 years. And I saw the whole road at once. The interviews. A caseworker at my kitchen table with a laptop. A 9-year-old in a room somewhere with a stranger who has a stuffed animal on the desk, saying it over again, 4 times, on the record. And Etta at 15, at 22, at 40, standing in a kitchen at Christmas with her father not in it, knowing the way you know the year you were born that she was the one who said it. She'd have been right to say it. She was right. She was also 9, and being right at 9 is a thing you carry differently. So I said, "Yes, I've got something to tell you." I said, "I was awake." He put his pen down. I said, "On the 27th of May, I was in the hallway at 10 past 2, and I watched my son put a pan on my stove and turn the burner on and leave it. And on the 2nd of June, I sat up in the kitchen and watched him do it again, and I turned it off 2 minutes after he went upstairs. And I've sat up every night since." Dr. Sandhu said, "Why didn't you say that an hour ago?" I said, "Because an hour ago I still thought I could hold it by myself." He wrote for a while. Then he looked up and he said, "You understand that this changes the shape of it. This is now an adult witness." I said, "That's what I'm counting on." And then I asked him for the only thing I ever asked anybody for in this whole story. I said, "Doctor, when this goes wherever it goes, it came from me. I'm the one who saw it. Nobody has to hear a 9-year-old's name in it, from me or from you or from anybody who was standing in that hallway." He said, "I can't promise you that. It doesn't work that way." I said, "I know it doesn't. I'm not asking you to lie down for me. I'm asking you not to lead with her." He looked at me for a long moment. He said, "That I can do." I told Lou Doss the same thing in the corridor, in about 9 words, and Lou Doss has kept harder secrets than that one. And then I went out and I told my son. Not in the corridor. In the parking garage, on level 2, standing between our car and somebody's van, because I was not going to do it in front of his daughter. I said, "Curtis, I saw you." He said, "Saw me what?" I said, "The 27th of May, 10 past 2. You put the pan on, and you folded the towel, and you laid it on the counter beside the burner, and then you went to bed." I have seen my son's face do a lot of things. I had never seen it do that. He said, "Mom." I said, "I told the doctor. It's already gone. There's going to be a call to somebody today, and there's nothing either of us can do to take it back, and I want you to hear it from me standing here instead of from a stranger on the phone." He said, "You told," and then he stopped, because he was working out how much I knew and how long I'd known it, and I watched him do that arithmetic in real time, and it took him about 4 seconds, and at the end of it my son leaned back against the car and put both hands over his face. He said, "How long?" I said, 2 weeks. He said, 2 weeks. And then, with his hands still over his face, he said, "You'd have been safe there, Ma. That's the part nobody's going to." I said, "Don't." He stopped. I said, "You can believe that for the rest of your life if you need to. You're not going to say it out loud to me." I said, "Once I put that pan back, I sat up in the kitchen every night, Curtis, because Etta sleeps 12 feet from that stove." And that was the only cruel thing I said to my son in this entire story, and I have never once taken it back, because it was also the true thing, and I had earned the right to say it in a chair in the dark from 11 to 4. A woman from the county came to my house on the Thursday. She was about 35, and she had a laptop, and she was kind, and she was not there for me. She was there about a 9-year-old, which is correct, and which I had to keep reminding myself was correct every time I wanted to explain my son to her. I gave my statement twice, once to her and once, 3 weeks later, to a deputy in a room with a window that didn't open. The same words both times. The 27th of May, 10 past 2, the pan, the knob, the towel. The 2nd of June, the nights after. My statement became the spine of it. Whatever the county knew about that corridor, none of it ever came from me, and nobody ever pressed me on who else had been standing there. I've never asked why not. Curtis was out of my house in 11 days. That was the safety plan, and it was not a negotiation. And it was not up to me. A man does not go on living in the house where the thing happened while the county is deciding about it. He went to his brother-in-law's in Zanesville. Alyssa and Etta stayed in my house in that first stretch, which is a sentence I never expected to write. There was no trial. The prosecutor resolved it with a reduced plea. There was a fine, and there were court-ordered classes, and there were 4 sentences in the Marisburg paper that did not name Etta. Cedar Row never came up again. Not once. That plan had always been a longer road than my son thought it was. A clinic letter would not have handed him this house. He'd have needed a court and a filing and a hearing where I'd have sat there with a lawyer of my own and said no. The letter was only ever meant to be the first piece of it. He didn't even get the first piece. Alyssa and Etta moved out to Zanesville in September to be near him, which was the right thing and which I told her so. Alyssa and I have never once talked about it. She helped him build the story for 3 years, and I don't believe she knew what he did at 2 a.m. And both of those are true, and they sit in the same room badly. She calls me on Sundays. She's careful with me now in a way I can't stand and can't ask her to stop. Lou Doss moved into the room off the kitchen in the middle of all of it and never moved back out. I framed it as money, because money is a thing nobody argues with. I said the counter had cut my Thursdays, and I could use $400 a month, and Lou had a lease coming up over the shop. Every word of that was true, and neither of us has ever pretended it was the reason. I moved back into my own bedroom, the one at the back, the quiet one. The sewing table came up from the basement in October. Lou carried one end. It's by the window in the front room, on the good light. Over the outlet, Jerry ran along the baseboard in 2011. The mailbox plaque is still up. EST 2023. Cut letters, a little scroll at each end. I know what it says, and I know what it cost, and I'd rather look at it than explain it to anybody. Here is what I have never told my son. He knows I saw him. He has known that since a parking garage on level 2, and he will know it for the rest of his life. And I did that to him on purpose, and I would do it again. He knew AITA had seen him once. She'd told him so herself months before, and he'd told her it was to help her grandma. And I expect he thought that was the end of it. What he has never had from me is confirmation. He may have wondered. There were months in there when he could have sat down and worked out that a doctor doesn't stop mid-sentence over a woman with a normal screen. And I have no way of knowing whether he ever did. What I know is that he never once asked me, and that if he had, I'd have given him the same answer I gave the county. I was awake. I saw him. It came from me. So that's where he's put it. On his mother, who sat in the dark for a fortnight and then walked into an office and ended him. That isn't the whole of what happened. It's the part I'm willing to sign. Whether that was mercy, I couldn't tell you. It wasn't mercy to him. He got a plea and a fine and classes and 4 sentences in the paper. It was mercy to her, and that's the only place I ever spent any. And I have to keep it there. Every year he doesn't ask is another year I don't have to decide. And if he ever does ask, I already know what I'll say. Because correcting it means handing a 9-year-old the receipt. He came to Thanksgiving that first year. He sat at my table and he passed me the salt, and our fingers touched on the shaker. And he said, "Ma, you want me to grab you anything while I'm out?" And he meant it. And I said, "No thank you, honey." I lost him at 2:10 in the morning on the 27th of May. Everything after that has been visits. AITA. That's the part I had to fix, and it was the only part that scared me. We had it out that same night, in the basement, on the stairs, with the machine off. She was in pieces. 9-year-olds don't cry the way you'd think. She was furious. She kept saying, "I wasn't telling on him." I said, "I know you weren't." She said, "The doctor asked me a question." I said, "He did, and you answered it true. That's the whole job, baby. That's all you ever have to do." She said, "Is Daddy in trouble?" And I said, "Your dad did something he shouldn't have, and grown-ups are going to sort it out, and none of that is your job." She said, "Because of me?" And here it is. The whole story, in a question from a 9-year-old on a basement stair. I said, "No, baby, because of me. I saw him do it, and I'm the one who told." That is the one thing I have ever said to my granddaughter that wasn't true. I've had 2 years to wish I'd said something else, and I never have. She said, "Are you mad at him?" And I told her the truth, because you can't do that twice in one night to a child who trusts you. I said, "Grandma's sad about some grown-up things that aren't yours. None of it is yours. Do you understand me? Not one bit of it." She said, "Okay." And then she wanted to know if her hem was crooked, because she was 9, and the world has an off switch at that age, and thank God for it. We kept Friday nights, even after Zanesville. 50 minutes each way, and she came every second Friday for 2 years, and now she's 11, and she comes on the bus by herself and thinks that's the greatest thing that ever happened to anyone. Her stitches are good now, small and even, and she doesn't tug the thread anymore. In April, she hemmed a pair of her own jeans start to finish and brought them over to show me, and I made her turn them inside out on the table, and I looked at that seam for a good long while. I said, "Who taught you that?" She said, "You did, obviously." I want to leave you with 2 Sundays. The first one is the 12th of April, 2 years ago, 3 days before the anniversary, 4 in the morning, a kitchen full of smoke, and a woman standing in a doorway saying, "I don't know." The second one was 2 weeks ago. Etta's 11 now, and she got it into her head that she's going to learn to cook. And she has decided that the way you learn to cook is Sunday breakfast, in the pan, because I told her about her grandfather and the $2. I got up at 7 and she was already down there. The light was on over the stove and she had the pan on the front burner and she was standing in front of it in her socks with a spatula, doing the thing her grandfather used to do, narrating it. She said, "Now here is a girl who knows what she's doing." And she burnt the toast. I stood at the mouth of my hallway with my hand flat on the wall, the same 3 feet of floor, and I watched my granddaughter turn the knob on my stove in my house. I didn't say anything for a minute. I just let her cook. There's a kind of woman this happens to. She's the one who says, "Of course." She's the one who moves the sewing table and takes the back bedroom and says, "That's fine, honey," and doesn't make a thing out of a mailbox. People will tell you she's a pushover. She isn't. She's just decided 100 times that the piece was worth more than the point. If that's you, here's the only thing I learned that was worth the price of it. Being the quiet one is not the same as being the one who doesn't notice. I noticed all of it, the whole time, sitting in a chair in the dark from 11 to 4. And when the day came, I said every word of it out loud, and I let it land on my son exactly the way it was always going to land on him. I kept one thing back. I never told him whose mouth it came out of first, and I never will. That's mine. Nobody signed off on it. And the girl who cooked my breakfast 2 weeks ago and burnt the toast has never once wondered whether she did something wrong. I'm still not a woman who makes a fuss. I just stopped being a woman anybody gets to explain. If any part of this sat in your chest, if you've been the one who says, "Of course," and hands over the chair and gets talked about in the next room, do me a favor and leave a comment because I read them and because somebody else needs to see that they're not the only one. Send this to the woman you thought of while you were listening. And if you're new here, subscribe. There's a new confession here every day, and I'll see you in the next one.